I mean, there have always been frightening stories and stories of monsters and apparitions, and spectral figures and so on. And so humans have a need, the origins of Halloween, we have a need to be frightened.
The definition of horror is painful and intense fear, dread, or dismay or intense. With such a brutal definition, one can't help but question what is it about horror movies that beckon audiences to keep coming back decade after decade for well over a century now. The first horror movies were not even called as such until the 1930s. In the late 18th century, when film was still a brand new technology, they went by the term spook tales and were essentially short reels with macabre subject matter. Since then, we've come a long way. While these shorts are certainly not without their charm, it wasn't until the 1920s that these spook tales would start to become something more. During World War I, Germany put a ban on all foreign films. This would be a huge boon to the German film industry, which went from producing 24 films in 1914 to producing 130 films in 1918.
There's a domino effect, and so something that on the surface seems bad, they ban foreign films, then opens the door for the native-born filmmakers now to make more films, and there's more encouragement for them to make more films.
These first horror films would be heavily inspired by German Expressionism, with sets and stories that take on surreal, dreamlike qualities.
The German film of that time was influential in a lot of ways, and for a lot of other genres too. Film noir owes a lot to German Expressionism. And so the Germans basically invented horror. I mean, horror had been around before that. There had been some American films that were ghost stories and things like that. But it was the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari that in 1920 that some film historians say might have been the first true horror film.
Using sets and settings entirely designed by Walter Rohrig, Herman Worm, and Walter Reimann, this movie discards any sense of reality, instead focusing on tall shadows and sets that are intentionally out of proportion and askew.
And it included or utilized this expressionistic style. In fact, it's probably the world's most extreme example of expressionism.
Over in other parts of the world, Hollywood, insistence on realism, was starting to catch up financially in important European markets. As a response to this, German filmmakers would begin to incorporate realism into their films without losing their iconic expressionist edge.
In 1922, there was a film by a guy named F.W. Murnau, another German filmmaker, called Nosferatu, and he essentially, without permission, adapted Bram Stoker's Dracula and made it a film and applied the expressionistic style to it. And so a lot of the look of vampire movies in particular to this day kind of comes from Nosferatu in just the use of shadow and light and just the set design and just the overall kind of mood and feel of those films. And
Well, here, Here's the lease. Why, I hope I've brought enough labels for your luggage.
That expressionism then led into the American films, because a lot of the early American horror films in the 1930s were films that utilized this expressionistic style. And so Karl Freund, in fact, worked on some of those early films. He directed The Mummy in the early 1930s, and there was Dracula in 1931 with Bela Lugosi, and then Frankenstein, was in 1931, directed by James Whale, with Boris Karloff as the monster. These all borrowed from the German expressionistic look, and were American films, though. Well, they're classic stories, first of all, and they're just memorable characters. Frankenstein's monster, that's so unique and distinctive, that Dr. Frankenstein created a living creature, out of body parts, and so it's, just going back to the original book, from the early 1800s, it's just a great story, and like all great stories and great characters that pass through the ages, a lot of these are just iconic because they are interesting and they're different, and when they first created them, Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley, Dracula and Frankenstein's monster and all that kind of stuff, they put a lot of thought into making that an interesting person, or whatever it is, a monster, which technically maybe not a person. They were turbulent times, the late 60s and the early 70s, especially with the Vietnam War and racial tensions and civil rights movement and counterculture and the hippie movement, the generation gap and all this kind of stuff. And so oftentimes turmoil results in great art.
Mr. Ambassador, welcome, sir. Good morning.
As people are trying to express and deal with the turmoil in lives and in society. And so I think that made 70s film interesting as well. And so there were just a lot of great films in the 70s that had something to say. And the filmmakers had the liberation to say it how they wanted to. there were really good movies in the 80s. There were a lot of really great movies, but the 80s in general in society was a more boring decade, and so the 80s was just a kind of, compared to the 70s at least, was boring, and the films of that era aren't as distinctive as the 70s. A lot of the horror films got, and this started in the 70s, but the 80s it kind of picked up, I think. They got more graphic.
Clear!
Clear.
Gotcha, didn't I, you little sucker?
Horror in the 1980s featured many slasher movies, seemingly one every weekend. With huge successes of the 70s from horror films like Halloween and Steven Spielberg's Jaws, horror was now a big business. Slashers were a popular choice, which favored shock, gore, and sex to entice a younger demographic of people in their early 20s. One of the most famous 80s slashers being Friday the 13th, which went to the extremes with its violence and sex. It featured a lot of naked teenagers and ultimately their bloody deaths.
And that was when they started being referred to as like dead teenager movies. And so I always liked that phrase, the dead teenager movies. And if you think about it, it's always the teens usually doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and they end up murdered, and usually out in the woods somewhere. And they got more, they became known more as the slasher films. And that was when I got less interested in them, because they're just too graphic, and they were using the intensity of the violence as shock value rather than relying on the feeling of dread or anticipation, of the violence. They were too blatant with it. And so that was one thing about the 80s. I think that's distinctive when it comes to horror, is there was more of an emphasis on the graphic nature of the violence. They were the slasher, dead teenager movies.
By the late 1990s and early 2000s, horror had gone under yet another shift. Horror films had become self-parodying.
Please welcome Jason.
Viewers wanted realism. An answer to this was the fairly obscure found film genre.
Josh, is that you down there? Josh.
Like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre before it, the Blair Witch Project understood the importance of a clever marketing campaign, or directly lying to your audience. Going beyond the tired, based on a true story line, Blair Witch sold the idea that what people were witnessing on screen was not realism or based in reality, but reality itself.
Paul, because it was my project, and I insisted on everything. I insisted that we weren't lost. I insisted that we keep going. I insisted that we walk south. Everything had to be my way. And this is where we've ended up. And it's all because of me that we're here now. Hungry, and cold, and hunted. I love you, Mom.
Using one of the first viral internet marketing campaigns, complete with a dossier consisting of fake police reports, missing posters urging viewers to come forward with any potential information about the campers, interviews with the parents of the missing characters, and a mockumentary retelling the supposed true Blair Witch legend. With all these marketing tactics combined, Blair Witch would go on to make $250 million worldwide on the absolutely meager budget of only $60,000.
The marketing of that was brilliant, so they were really smart. It was a very low budget movie, shot with just digital cameras, and which anybody can own, and because they marketed it and made people so curious about it, it became a big hit. And of course, it was a unique concept, the found footage idea. Everything I know about it, it's good, but it's low budget, nothing extraordinary, and it's really the idea of it more than anything that makes it effective. But the marketing then, was the key thing, of course, then it became a big hit, and so then there were the other found footage type of films that followed it, and trying to duplicate that success. So it's a landmark film.
For better or for worse, the current events tend to shape the arts happening around them. By this point in the game, viewers were no longer scared by wisecracking serial killers, haunted houses with ghosts,
little pigs, let me come in,
or boogeymen. What we deemed scary was our capacity to suffer at the hands of others. Removing any sense of screwball or slapstick to the splatter genre of the 80s, torture porn leads fully into the gore and violence without any of the whimsy that helped make it palatable for audiences back then. But audiences had changed, and they came to see it in droves. There's a certain visceral reaction that we get from seeing people in pain, even if we know it isn't real. A squeamish feeling caused by the adrenaline our brain instinctively doles out when witnessing intense violence, real or otherwise. As fleeting as this feeling may be, torture porn proved there was money in it. And with audiences witnessing intense violence halfway around the world every day on their televisions thanks to the War on Terror, it should come as no surprise that Hostel, a film about a couple of backpackers traveling through Europe who are kidnapped and tortured by wealthy Europeans, would go on to recoup nearly 20 times its initial budget. If audiences had to endure scenes of the lowest depths of what humans are capable of doing to each other from their news media outlets, they should be able to escape to the movies and witness a fictionalized version of it. Audiences and studios agreed on that sentiment, because after Hostel and Saw that came before it, many films that fit the torture porn mold were released in very rapid succession, including Wolf Creek, House of 1000 Corpses, Captivity, and countless Hostel and Saw movies.
You're paralyzed. Just like that day when you did nothing. You did nothing.
Well, it's just what I addressed before. I think the future of horror movies is, in my opinion, and I've read some other things where people are saying that there are signs of this, that the audience is tired of the slasher films and the graphic violence, and that we may be headed back towards more suspense and dread and anticipation of where we feel this inside rather than it being thrown in our face.
Now, sink into the floor. Wait. Sink.
Is that the reason people like horror films is because it makes us feel alive. Because it's part of life is to be frightened of things and have anxiety. And even though we might want to avoid those feelings, if we can choose to see it and know it's just a movie, then we can experience that aspect of being alive.